The courtroom was unusually quiet that morning, as though the walls themselves knew something more than the people inside. The smell of polished oak benches and paper files filled the air, blending with the tension that clung to every breath. Judge Nathaniel Carter, a man known across the state for his composure and steady hand in moments of high pressure, sat poised behind the bench. He had presided over hundreds of cases in his decades-long career, but as he glanced at the docket before him, nothing suggested the storm about to break open his carefully measured world. The bailiff's voice carried across the room, case number for 72. The state versus Marcus Green. At that moment, the defendant rose from his seat. He was a tall black man in his early 40s, his shoulders broad yet visibly burdened by the weight of years and circumstances. His face carried lines not just of age but of survival. Lines etched from struggle, scars from unseen battles, and the quiet resilience of a man who had fought too many wars without weapons. His eyes, dark and cautious, scanned the room before they landed squarely on the man seated high on the bench. And that's when it happened. For the first time in years, Judge Carter's mask slipped. His steady gaze wavered. His breath caught. He knew this man. Not from the papers, not from the charges, not from the grim reputation whispered among lawyers. He knew him from childhood. From long afternoons running through fields, from scraped knees and laughter under summer skies. Marcus Green wasn't just another name on a docket. He was Nathaniel's best friend, once upon a time, when the world was smaller and dreams still felt possible. The room continued as if nothing had shifted, but for the judge and the defendant, time froze. The lawyers shuffled their papers, the jury glanced around, but neither man could look away from the other. Marcus's face, once filled with boyish mischief and a light that could brighten the darkest corner, now looked tired, hardened, almost defeated. Still, beneath the weariness, Nathaniel saw the boy he had known, the one who used to talk about becoming a musician, who swore he would never let the world break him down. Now, he stood accused of armed robbery, his life hanging in the balance. Nathaniel's hand tightened around his gavel, though he didn't strike it. Judges are trained to detach, to view every case through the lens of law, not personal history. But in that moment, Nathaniel Carter was not just a judge, he was a man staring into the past, haunted by questions that demanded answers. The prosecutor began to speak, painting Marcus as a career criminal. His voice was sharp, practiced, almost mechanical as he laid out the charges. But Nathaniel barely heard him. His mind was back in their old neighborhood, on streets where opportunity was scarce, where children were told to dream but given nothing to build those dreams upon. He remembered the difference between his life and Marcus's, the way his parents had been able to move him to a better school, the way doors had quietly opened for him while others slammed shut in Marcus's face. And as the defense attorney rose to counter, Nathaniel knew this case wasn't just about robbery. It was about survival, about systems, about the lines drawn in childhood that determined who would rise and who would fall. The jury leaned in, some skeptical, some sympathetic, but none of them carried the weight of memory that Nathaniel bore. He remembered Marcus's laugh, his fire, his endless insistence that he was worth more than what the world told him. And now, to see him shackled, standing in the harsh light of judgment, it tore something open inside the judge that had long been sealed. When the recess was called, Nathaniel retreated to his chambers, but his thoughts offered no refuge. He remembered a day when they were 12 years old. They had been walking home from school when two police officers stopped them. Nathaniel, lighter-skinned and dressed in clothes his parents could afford, was told to go on home. Marcus, darker, wearing a second-hand shirt, was searched, humiliated, treated like a suspect though he was just a boy with homework in his bag. Nathaniel had stood frozen, ashamed, unable to speak up. And afterward, Marcus had simply shrugged it off, saying, "That's how it is, Nate. You get used to it." But Marcus hadn't gotten used to it. No one really does. The world had carved that day into his soul, and 1,000 more days like it had followed. Nathaniel had gone on to college, law school, the bench. Marcus had been left to fight battles against poverty, prejudice, and a system that had decided his worth before he even became a man. Now, the system sat ready to consume him again, and Nathaniel was part of it. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, his heart heavy. What was justice? Was it the law written on paper, or was it something deeper, the recognition of truth, of dignity, of humanity? He was sworn to uphold the law, but he was also sworn to serve justice. And those two had never felt further apart than in this moment. When court resumed, Nathaniel took his place once more, his face composed but his spirit unsettled. He could feel Marcus watching him, not with anger, but with a silent question. Do you remember me? Do you remember who I was before they told you who I was supposed to be? The defense attorney began questioning Marcus directly, asking him about his life, his struggles, his reasons. As Marcus spoke, his voice carried years of pain but also strength. He talked about growing up in a neighborhood that offered more liquor stores than libraries, about losing jobs because of the color of his skin, about watching opportunities vanish before he could even touch them. And as he spoke, Nathaniel felt his chest tighten. This wasn't just testimony. It was truth, raw, unpolished, and undeniable. It wasn't the kind of truth you could measure in legal briefs or statutes. It was the truth of a black man who had been forced to fight every day just to exist. And Nathaniel knew the jury would hear it differently than he did. To them, Marcus might still sound like a man making excuses. To Nathaniel, he sounded like a mirror reflecting everything he himself had been spared. The gavel struck. Court was adjourned for the day. But the real trial had only just begun, not the one unfolding before the jury, but the one raging inside Judge Nathaniel Carter's heart. Because tomorrow, he would not just be a judge. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether he could truly see Marcus, not as a defendant, but as the boy who once stood beside him, dreaming of a life free from chains. And what he chose to do next would shock everyone. The night after that first day in court, Judge Nathaniel Carter found no peace in his home. He sat in his study long after midnight, the soft glow of a desk lamp illuminating stacks of case files. But it wasn't the papers in front of him that held his attention, it was Marcus's face, his voice, the memories that refused to fade. The law books around him felt suddenly hollow, their words rigid and cold, stripped of the humanity he had seen so clearly in Marcus's testimony. For years, Nathaniel had taken pride in being impartial, in upholding the dignity of the court by keeping emotion at bay. But tonight, impartiality felt like betrayal. If he pretended Marcus was just another defendant, wasn't he erasing not only their shared past but also the truth of Marcus's story? He leaned back, rubbing his temples. He remembered when they were boys, sneaking into the old Baptist church on the corner after choir practice. Marcus would sit at the piano, fingers clumsy but determined, and play until the janitor chased them out. One day, I'm gonna make something with this, Marcus used to say. Music will take me somewhere better. Nathaniel had believed him. He had believed in him. But somewhere along the line, the world had stolen that dream. Nathaniel thought of his own journey, how scholarships had come, how mentors had appeared, how opportunities had unfolded as though a road had been cleared just for him. And he thought of Marcus, walking the same streets but stumbling over barricades Nathaniel never had to face. It wasn't that Marcus lacked ambition. It was that ambition alone wasn't enough in a world that measured black men by their skin before their character. The next morning, as he put on his robes, Nathaniel felt the weight of both his past and his duty pressing down on him. When he entered the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Reporters filled the gallery, sensing that this was no ordinary case. Marcus sat at the defense table, his hands folded, his eyes focused straight ahead. But when Nathaniel looked at him, he saw more than a defendant. He saw the boy who had once played piano keys like they were stepping stones to freedom. The prosecution called its next witness, a store clerk who claimed Marcus had been the man holding the gun during the robbery. The clerk, a young white man, pointed at Marcus without hesitation, his voice steady, his certainty unshaken. "That's him," he said. "I'll never forget his face." The courtroom murmured. The prosecution's case seemed stronger with every word. But Nathaniel's trained ear caught something, a tone rehearsed, too confident, as though conviction was built not on memory but on the story he'd been told to believe. Then came the defense. Marcus's attorney, a young black woman named Camille Johnson, stood tall as she questioned the witness. Her presence was commanding, her voice firm but respectful. She pointed out inconsistencies, small cracks in the clerk's certainty. Why had he originally described the suspect as shorter? Why had he been unable to identify Marcus in the first lineup, only recognizing him after police showed his photo again? The witness stumbled, hesitated. The jury shifted uncomfortably. Nathaniel watched closely. He admired Camille's courage, the way she refused to let bias slip unnoticed into the record. She reminded him of something his grandmother used to say, "Truth don't always shout, Nate. Sometimes it whispers, and you got to be quiet enough to hear it." But truth, Nathaniel knew, often had to fight its way through walls of prejudice before it could be seen. When Marcus was called to testify again, the room seemed to hold its breath. He rose slowly, walked to the stand, and placed his hand on the Bible. His voice was steady but carried a rawness that cut through the silence. "I didn't do this," he began. "I'm not saying I've never made mistakes. I have. More than I can count. But I didn't commit this robbery." He paused, glancing briefly at Nathaniel before continuing. "You all see me standing here in chains, and maybe some of you already made up your mind about what kind of man I am. But I need you to understand something. Where I come from, every day was a battle. I've been stopped, searched, doubted, and dismissed since I was 12 years old. I've lost jobs because of my name, lost chances because of my skin. And through all of that, I kept fighting to stay upright. To be a father to my kids. To be a man I could still respect when I looked in the mirror." His words pierced the courtroom. The jurors shifted again, some visibly moved, others visibly resistant. But Nathaniel heard more than testimony. He heard a confession of survival, a declaration of dignity from a man the system had tried to erase. Camille asked him gently, "Marcus, where were you the night of the robbery?" Marcus exhaled slowly. "I was at home. My daughter was sick. I spent the night sitting by her bed, praying she'd get better. That's where I was. But I guess my word ain't enough when the world already decided who I am." Silence followed his words, heavy and undeniable. Nathaniel felt a lump in his throat. He kept his face composed, but inside, his heart was breaking. He remembered the boy who used to sit beside him and talk about becoming more than what the world expected. Now here he was, stripped of presumption of innocence, begging to be seen for the man he truly was. When court adjourned for lunch, Nathaniel stayed behind in his chambers. He couldn't shake Marcus's words. "My word ain't enough." Wasn't that the truth of it? In this country, in this system, a black man's word had always been measured against the weight of suspicion. Nathaniel had spent his career inside the law, but Marcus's testimony reminded him that justice wasn't blind, it was selective. As the afternoon session began, Camille Johnson called her final witness, Marcus's daughter, a young teenager named Aliyah. She walked nervously to the stand, clutching a small notebook in her hands. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "My dad was home with me that night," she said softly. "I had a fever, and he stayed with me the whole time. He read to me, even though I don't remember much because I was so sick. But I remember his voice. I remember he was there." Her testimony was simple, unpolished, but it carried a weight that no legal argument could replicate. A father's love, a child's memory, the undeniable truth of presence. The prosecution tried to shake her, suggesting she was too young, too ill to know for sure. But she didn't falter. She lifted her chin and said firmly, "I know my dad was there. I know what I remember." The courtroom was silent again, but this silence was different. It was the kind that came when truth slipped past prejudice and landed where it could no longer be ignored. Nathaniel looked at Marcus, who sat with tears in his eyes, pride and pain mingling in his expression. And Nathaniel knew this case was no longer just about evidence. It was about whether justice could see beyond assumption, beyond bias, and recognize dignity. As the day ended and court recessed once more, Nathaniel sat quietly, his gavel still in hand. He understood what was at stake. Not just Marcus's future, but his own integrity as a man sworn to uphold justice. He had been given power, and now that power demanded more than impartiality. It demanded courage. Because tomorrow, the trial would reach its climax. And whatever Nathaniel chose to do, the world would never forget it. The third day of trial dawned grey and heavy, as though even the sky carried the weight of what was to come. Judge Nathaniel Carter stood at the mirror, straightening his tie, but the man staring back at him felt different. His reflection no longer looked like the calm arbiter of law the world knew, it looked like a man torn between duty and conscience. When he arrived at the courthouse, reporters crowded the steps, their cameras flashing like lightning. Questions were hurled at him. Judge Carter, do you think Marcus Green will walk free? But he gave no answer. Judges were supposed to stay silent. Neutral. Detached. Yet as he walked past, the silence he carried was not the silence of neutrality, it was the silence of a man wrestling with truths too dangerous to speak aloud. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with restless energy. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable masks. Marcus sat at the defense table, his shoulders squared but his eyes betraying exhaustion. Camille Johnson leaned over, whispering something to him that drew the faintest nod of reassurance. Across the aisle, the prosecutor shuffled papers, confident, certain that the evidence was enough. Nathaniel struck the gavel. Court is now in session. The final arguments began. The prosecutor rose first, his tone sharp, his delivery deliberate. He painted Marcus as a man who had walked the wrong path for years, a man who had chosen crime over responsibility. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he said, his voice carrying across the room, this is not about sympathy. It is about safety. The defendant stood in that store with a gun. He made a choice, and that choice has consequences. We cannot let excuses erase accountability. His words landed with force, each sentence tightening the chain around Marcus's neck. Some jurors nodded. Others frowned. But the narrative was clear, Marcus wasn't a man to be understood, he was a danger to be removed. Then Camille Johnson rose. She walked slowly, deliberately, her eyes scanning the jury, not with pleading but with conviction. This case, she began, is not just about Marcus Green. It is about what you choose to see when you look at him. Do you see the caricature of a criminal the prosecution wants you to believe in? Or do you see a father, a neighbor, a man who has fought his whole life against barriers you will never face? She paused, letting the silence linger. Yes, Marcus has stumbled. Who among us hasn't? But stumbling does not make a man guilty of a crime he did not commit. You heard his daughter. You heard his testimony. You saw the cracks in the state story. And you know, deep down, that truth does not live in rehearsed certainty, it lives in memory, in presence, in love. Marcus was home. He was with his child. That is the truth. Her voice grew stronger. But there is something else you must consider. For generations, men like Marcus have stood in rooms like this, facing juries who chose not to see them as men at all. They were seen as threats, as problems, as cases to be closed. I am asking you, I am challenging you, not to repeat that history. To look at Marcus and see him for who he is, not who the world has told you he must be. The courtroom was silent. The words hung in the air, daring the jurors to confront themselves. Nathaniel's heart pounded. He felt the force of Camille's truth pressing against his chest. He wanted to nod, to affirm her, but he sat still, the robe on his shoulders reminding him of the role he was sworn to play. When closing arguments ended, Nathaniel gave the jury their instructions. His voice was calm, controlled, but inside, each word felt like a stone placed on his own chest. You must deliberate carefully, based on the evidence presented, without prejudice, without fear, and without favor. The jury filed out, leaving the room tense and hushed. Marcus sat quietly, staring down at his hands. His daughter's eyes never left him. Hours passed. Then came the knock at the door. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled again, the gallery buzzing with anticipation. Nathaniel adjusted his robe, his face composed, though every muscle in his body trembled with what was about to unfold. The foreman rose, holding a folded piece of paper. He handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Nathaniel unfolded it, his eye scanning the words that could either destroy or restore a life. But before he read it aloud, something within him shifted. He looked at Marcus, then at the jury, then at the paper in his hand. And for the first time in his long career, Nathaniel Carter realized that following protocol alone would not be enough. He cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady but carrying an edge of something deeper, something personal. "Before I read this verdict, there is something I need to say." The room stiffened. Judges didn't do this. They didn't speak before verdicts. They didn't break the sacred ritual of procedure. But Nathaniel pressed on. "I have presided over many trials in my life. I have seen countless defendants come and go. But rarely have I been reminded so powerfully that behind every case file, every charge, every accusation, there is a human being with a story. Marcus Green is not just a name on this docket. He is a man, a father, a neighbor, and yes, someone I have known in another lifetime." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously. Marcus's eyes widened, shock etched across his face. Nathaniel continued. "I will not allow this court to ignore the humanity of the man before us. Justice is not blind, not truly. Too often, it sees exactly what it wants to see. And when it looks at men like Marcus, it sees danger instead of dignity. That is not justice. That is a failure of justice." The prosecutor rose in protest, "Your Honor." But Nathaniel raised his hand, silencing him. "Know what I risk by saying this. But I will not sit silently while this court pretends that the struggles Marcus has faced do not matter. His word matters. His daughter's word matters. And the truth matters." He looked back at the paper in his hand. "The jury has reached its verdict. But I want every person in this room to remember, no matter what this paper says, that dignity cannot be stripped away by chains, and justice cannot be found in prejudice." He turned the paper over, preparing to read the words aloud. The entire courtroom leaned forward, the tension unbearable. And in that instant, as Nathaniel opened his mouth, the world seemed to hold its breath. Because what came next would not only decide Marcus's fate, it would shake the very foundations of the court itself. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the reporters, so quick with their pens and cameras, seemed to pause, waiting for Judge Nathaniel Carter to break the tension. He held the verdict slip in his hand, but for a brief moment, it felt like he held the weight of history itself. His voice cut through the stillness. "The jury finds the defendant, Marcus Green." Time slowed. Marcus's daughter clutched her hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. Camille Johnson fixed her eyes on the judge, her jaw set, as if she willed him to speak truth into the air. The prosecutor leaned forward, certain he would hear confirmation of his victory. And Marcus? Marcus kept his eyes closed, his lips moving silently in a prayer only he and God could hear. Nathaniel exhaled, then read aloud, "Not guilty." The words landed like a thunderclap. For a second, the room was stunned, almost disbelieving. Then sound erupted. Gasps. Cries. The shuffle of reporters scrambling to capture the moment. Marcus's daughter leapt to her feet, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "Daddy! Daddy!" Marcus opened his eyes, disbelief and relief washing over him in waves. He turned toward his daughter, and for the first time in years, a smile, fragile but real, broke across his face. Camille put her hand gently on his shoulder, her eyes wet with triumph. But amid the relief, a different storm brewed. The prosecutor slammed his hand on the table. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. You compromised the jury with your comments before the verdict was read. We will be filing motions for review immediately." Nathaniel met his gaze calmly. "You are free to file whatever motions you deem necessary, Counselor. But this jury reached its decision independently. My words did not dictate their choice, they revealed a truth this court has too often ignored." The prosecutor shook his head, furious, but the moment had already slipped beyond his control. As the bailiff moved to unshackle Marcus, The courtroom watched. The clink of chains hitting the floor echoed like a hymn, each link falling away a reminder of what had been stolen and what was now restored. Marcus stood tall, rubbing his wrists, no longer a defendant but a free man. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. Yet in the middle of the chaos, Marcus walked straight toward Nathaniel. For a heartbeat, it was as though the years fell away and they were boys again, two kids standing side by side, dreaming of lives untouched by chains. "Judge Carter," Marcus said, his voice low but steady. "You remembered me." Nathaniel's composure nearly cracked. He nodded slowly. "I never forgot you, Marcus." They didn't embrace, decorum forbade it, but their eyes held an understanding deeper than any gesture could capture. Later, outside the courthouse, the steps were flooded with people. Some cheered, some jeered, others simply stood stunned. For many, this was more than a trial. It was a glimpse into the fractures of justice, a reminder of both its failures and its possibilities. Camille Johnson addressed the crowd. Today's verdict is not just a victory for Marcus Green. It is a reminder that truth can still break through. But let us not mistake this for the end. For every Marcus who walks free, there are countless others who still sit behind bars, victims of a system that refuses to see their humanity. We celebrate today, but tomorrow, we keep fighting. Her words were carried by cameras across the nation. They resonated in living rooms, in churches, in community centers where Black families gathered and felt both pride and pain, the pride of a win, the pain of knowing how rare it still was. Marcus emerged a few minutes later, his daughter clinging to his side. She looked up at him with wide eyes, full of relief and admiration. "You're coming home, Daddy," she whispered. "Yes, baby," Marcus replied, his voice breaking. "I'm coming home." In the judge's chambers, Nathaniel removed his robe slowly, folding it across his chair. He sat alone, staring at his hands. He knew what would come: complaints, reviews, perhaps even attempts to remove him from the bench. But he felt no regret. For once, he had chosen conscience over silence, truth over neutrality. And though the system might punish him, he knew in his heart he had finally served justice. He remembered his grandmother's words. "When the time comes, you'll have to decide if you're a man of the law or a man of justice. Don't be afraid to choose right." That day, he had chosen right. In the weeks that followed, the case made headlines nationwide. Talk shows debated it, scholars dissected it, activists celebrated it. Some accused Judge Carter of overstepping his role, of contaminating the process with personal sentiment. But for many in the Black community, he had become a symbol, a judge who saw, who remembered, who dared to speak truth in a place where silence had been the rule. Marcus's life was not magically healed. The scars of years battling a hostile system didn't disappear overnight. But he walked free, and with freedom came the chance to rebuild. He found work with a local community program, mentoring young men whose lives mirrored his own. When he spoke to them, he told his story not as a tragedy, but as testimony. "They try to define me by chains. But dignity is something they can't take. Don't ever let them take yours." And Nathaniel? He continued to sit on the bench, though under constant scrutiny. Some called for his resignation. Others called him a hero. Through it all, he remained steady, carrying both the burden and the blessing of what he had done. But sometimes, late at night, he would think back to that day in court when he looked across the room and saw not a defendant, not a case, but a boy who had once been his friend. And he knew that in that moment, he had seen justice clearly, not in the letter of the law, but in the spirit of humanity. For the rest of his life, Nathaniel Carter would carry the knowledge that one choice, one act of courage, had changed everything. Because in that courtroom, when the judge recognized the man before him, what happened next shocked everyone. Not because the law had prevailed, but because, for once, justice had.